Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Greg Brown, and I am the Executive Director of Policy Bridge, a nonpartisan public policy think tank based here in Cleveland, Ohio. It gives me great pleasure to join with the St. Luke's Foundation and the Cuyahoga Place Matters team in welcoming you to this forum, the third in the Why Place Matters series. I am very honored to introduce today's speaker, Angela Glover Blackwell, founder and CEO of PolicyLink in Oakland, California. Under Ms. Blackwell's leadership, PolicyLink has welcomed and became a leading voice in the movement to use public policy to improve access, equity, and opportunities for all low-income people and communities of color, particularly in the areas of health, housing, transportation, education, and infrastructure. Recognized as a national authority on poverty issues, Ms. Blackwell is the co-author of Uncommon Common Ground, Race and America's Future, and contributed to Ending Poverty in America, How to Restore the American Dream, and The Covenant with Black America. She is also a frequent commentator for some of the nation's top news organizations, including the Washington Post, Salon, and the Huffington Post, and has appeared regularly on such shows as Marketplace, The Travis Smiley Show, Nightline, and PBS's Now. Prior to founding PolicyLink, Ms. Blackwell served as Senior Vice President at the Rockefeller Foundation, where she oversaw the foundation's domestic and cultural division. A lawyer by training, she gained national recognition as a founder of the Oakland, California's Urban Strategies Council, where she pioneered new approaches to neighborhood revitalization from 1977 to 1987. Ms. Blackwell was a partner at the Public Advocates Corporation, a nationally known public interest law firm. Ms. Blackwell earned a bachelor's degree from Howard University and a law degree from the University of California at Berkeley. It is my privilege and indeed an honor to introduce to you Angela Glover Blackwell.
It's a pleasure to be here, a delight to be back here. I always enjoy coming to Cleveland, Ohio. You are just a wonderful community with such a long history of caring about the issues and innovating and showing the nation that the problems that so often plague cities are not problems without solutions. PolicyLink watches what happens here because we often find this as a source for what is so important to us, which is lifting up what works. That's the motto for PolicyLink. Our mission is to address economic and social inequality and to promote economic and social equity. Our commitment is to do that by lifting up what works because we believe that local leaders or national leaders, they are solving the nation's problems. And if we could just spend more attention, spend more time looking at what people are doing in local communities, understanding why certain things are working, using our analytical abilities to tease out what the implications are for public policy, getting policies in place that reflect the wisdom, voice, and experience of people working for change in their local communities, we could create a landscape of achievement and expanding opportunity and solving the nation's problems and developing a more equitable society. Cleveland is very much a part of that mission, and I'm happy to be back here talking with you and learning from you. You heard me use the term equity 2-3 times right up till now, and it is very important for PolicyLink. That is what we are about, and so I always like to start off by defining what we mean by it. When I use the term equity, we mean nothing more than just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate and prosper. So the work of equity is to identify what it is we want for all to achieve at high levels, go on and reach your full potential, to be able to provide a supporting income for your family, to be able to live a healthy life, to identify what it is we want for all. And then the work of achieving equity is to then see what's the gap between where people are and where they need to be. So that we are about equity. And I try to use the term gap rather than the term disparities, though I make no judgments about the terms that people choose to use because we all know what we're talking about. But I like to use gap because I think that's what we really need to focus on, the gap between where people and groups are and where we want everyone to be. Because the disparities language is comparative language, and it's comparing not where we want to be, but where someone else is. And that's not really the challenge, because so often I have found when we use the language of disparities and what we're comparing is where black people are and where white people are, where Latino people are and where white people are. There are often many white people in the audience who identify with where the black and Latino people are, because that's where they are. Often the rural people who are white and rural feel that they completely identify with the language of what's happening to those who are being left behind, but they often get overlooked because of the way that we frame it up. So equity tries to close those gaps. And as we think about the work of closing the gaps, I think we're at an amazing moment in this nation because so many places and individuals and groups who have been left behind, who have been pursuing equity for a long time, are in a position to be able to help the nation as it tries to figure out how to go forward and be strong. If you think about it, our nation is challenged, even as places like Cleveland and Detroit and St. Louis and Kansas City are challenged. Our nation is challenged. We are facing the possibility of a dwindling and certainly vulnerable middle class in a nation that has prided itself on its middle class. It has been the thing that has given this nation a sense of entitlement in terms of its place on the international stage. The strong and vast middle class is being challenged. It's vulnerable. Even as we start to come out of the Great Recession, we know that we have not yet figured out a sustainable economic future for the nation in the global economy. That is part of what we are very much working on. And at the same time that we're facing those issues, we're experiencing something that either is going to be a problem or it's going to be an asset that we're going to build on. And it's our rapidly changing demographics. We are rapidly becoming a nation in which the majority of people will be people of color. That will happen by 2040. At first, the prediction was 2050, then it got adjusted to 2042, and now most people think it's going to happen around 2040 or perhaps slightly before. Already, 46.5% of all children who live in this nation are children of color. The majority of children born today are of color, and nearly the majority of those under 2 are already of color. And by the end of this decade, and we're well into this decade, the majority of all children will be children of color. I don't need to give you the data about poverty and obesity and health and all of that. I know that those of you who are here today and those of you who come all the time, you've seen the reports, you know the data. I won't drag all that out. My staff always gives me a running list of all the data, and it can be a very sad story. I tell them I'm not going to be welcome around the country if you keep sending me out this way. So I'm not going to go through it all, but you know it. And you know that if the high numbers of those children living in poverty, suffering the consequences of obesity, living in families of high unemployment, going to schools that are failing them, if those numbers continue and have their concentration among Black, Latino, Hmong, and Native American, and rural white the way that they have, and we look at the future, we know America's future is not bright. Because America can see its future, and it's a 5-year-old Latina girl. It's a 7-year-old Black boy. It's a 12-year-old Native American child. We know the future, and if we don't invest in it, we know the nation's future will not be bright. And so this notion of equity, the thing that you have been working on and I have been working on and many people around the country have been working on because it is the right thing to seek to achieve, because it is the moral thing to seek to achieve, continues to be right and moral, but it has also become an economic imperative. In many ways, equity, achieving it, will be the superior growth model for the nation. Because to the degree that we invest in those who are too often left behind and invest in the places that are so often left behind, we set up the nation for a bright, sustainable future where we can forget this notion that has been identified about children not doing as well as their parents, about children not living as long as their parents. We don't need to be that nation. We won't be that nation. We're not a poor nation. We need to stop acting like one. Equity is the superior growth model going forward. And when we think about equity, equity is very much tied to place, very much tied to place. We've become a nation, sadly, in which where you live is a proxy for opportunity. It determines whether or not you get to go to a good school, whether or not, if you're lucky enough to own a home, whether you have any value you can pull out of it in the event of an emergency or to pursue an entrepreneurial opportunity. It determines whether or not you are near a job center, near employment, whether or not you live in a community where you're part of a natural job network, which is the way that people get jobs, isn't it? If I asked a show of hands, if your first job came through knowing someone, most of your hands would go up. Natural job networks. If you don't live near one, you're at a disadvantage. It also determines whether or not you live near a good public transit system that can connect you to jobs wherever they might be in the region. Where we live has become a proxy for opportunity in America, and we need to do something about that. But where we live also determines how long we live and how well we live while we live. That when we think about it, it is such a disgrace that you can tell someone your zip code and they can tell you your life expectancy. That's not hyperbole, it's true. I was part of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation commissioned to build a healthier America. And one of the things that we found and reported from that work is that your life expectancy is tied to your zip code. In the San Francisco Bay Area where I live in the East Bay, where we have Berkeley and Oakland. People who live in the Berkeley Hills live on average 15 years longer than people who live in the West Oakland Flatlands, a distance of less than 5 miles. And it's true all over the nation. Where you live determines how long you live, but it also determines how well you live while you live. That so many of the issues that we worry about in terms of asthma and obesity and heart disease and high blood pressure and diabetes, they are all directly tied to place. And so it's important for those of us who are concerned about health as one of the key components to achieving equity, and you know that it is. Health and well-being is a key component to achieving equity, have to begin to really understand with depth how place impacts health and well-being. As we think about it, we actually try to break it up into very discrete areas, thinking about the economic environment, the physical environment, the social environment, and the service environment. I want to start with the economic environment. One of the other findings from the work that we did with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, commissioned to build a healthier America, was to identify how much the economic life of community and the economic status of the individual impacted health. Each rung lower on the economic ladder is associated with poorer health. And so the economic environment becomes very important. What's happening in terms of jobs and retail activity and people really having a sense of how to pursue making a living for their family and to pursue their entrepreneurial spirit, that impacts health and well-being. The good news is we have wonderful examples of how to focus on that. I want to take one thing that just cuts across everything that we care about, and that's the availability of fresh fruits and vegetables. The availability of fresh fruits and vegetables in the community is an economic issue because as we've become less focused on farms and growing our own vegetables on our small farms, we came as a nation to depend on grocery stores to provide fresh fruits and vegetables. It's not done equitably in America. Only 8% of African Americans live in a census tract with a grocery store. 23 million Americans live in something that's been designated by the U.S. Department of USDA of a desert, a food desert, where people have no access to fresh fruits and vegetables. And even though we have lots of other places where you could get them, corner stores, small markets, in too many communities that are Black and Latino, those things do not exist. We've been lamenting this for a long time. I've personally been working on it for 30 years. My husband often says, don't you ever work on anything new? I said, well, no, not until it's done. So for 30 years, I've been working on this problem of the exodus of food chains from low-income communities. When I first started working on it, more than 30 years ago, the governor was Jerry Brown the first time. And I was at Public Advocates, public interest law firm, and we filed an administrative petition with Governor Brown asking him to do something about the exodus of food chains from low-income communities. We had a well-organized effort. We represented groups up and down the state. Our work was on the front page of the newspaper. It got lots of attention. Then Governor Jerry Brown put together a special commission to respond to our administrative petition, and we got lots of things. Buying clubs, the first state legislation to actually promote farmers markets, but we got not one grocery store. And what I realized when we came back to the issue more than 25 years later was that we didn't get a grocery store because we didn't have a model. You really need the models, and that's why I love the things that you all are doing here in Cleveland. But the model emerged in Pennsylvania with the Pennsylvania Fresh Food Financing Initiative, in which in 2004, Governor Rendell put $30 million in the state's economic stimulus package. To date, it has been able to leverage $190 million, 86 grocery stores and other projects and outlets around the state, 500,000 people now having neighborhood access to fresh fruits and vegetables that didn't have it before, and 5,000 new jobs created, 5,000 jobs, over 500,000 people with access. Fabulous example. It's been lifted up. Working with the people who did it in Pennsylvania, we've gotten the Obama administration to put real money into a healthy food financing initiative so that now these resources are beginning to spread out across the country. You don't just have to lament that the economic environment doesn't promote health. We can do something about it. Finding models, teasing out the implications for policy, getting policy in place. The other thing, though, is that when we think about economy and health, place matters in terms of being able to make sure that people can connect to jobs. The grocery stores produce jobs, but there are many other ways to produce jobs. In California, there's a wonderful example with our energy company, PG&E, recognizing that so many of the employees were retiring and that jobs were going to be opening up, but that the kinds of jobs were actually changing, and the next generation needed a different kind of training to actually get those positions. And they started something called Power Pathway, a partnership between the community colleges and PG&E to be able to get people trained for jobs and in jobs, and to really focus on those neighborhoods where you had concentrations of young people who needed to get work, and helping them to move as a cohort through their community college that often is grounded in place. So there's a lot that we can do to improve the economic activity, and in improving the economic activity, we improve health because families have more income, but also because we can do smart things like get those businesses that provide fresh fruits and vegetables in the community. But let's talk about the physical environment for a moment. The physical environment has so much to do with health in place that there's some places that just have routinely put housing for the poor near the ports, where you have the trucks coming in and out and idling in neighborhoods, and then we look at epidemic asthma rates in those same communities. Thinking about where we put housing and where we put pollutants, we need to separate those things. We need to make sure we're protecting the children. Harlem at one point took a look at its extraordinary asthma rate, one of the highest in the nation, and they realized that the 6 bus depots bringing people from all over the New York region stopped right there in Harlem. All those buses coming in, no surprise that they had one of the highest asthma rates in the country. Thinking about these things as we are making decisions, very important. But they're wonderful examples. In Minneapolis, as they were thinking about bringing in light rail, the Isaiah, a community organizing initiative, a faith-based organizing initiative that had the trust and the ear and was in constant conversation with community, was able to get the community to say, let's do a health impact assessment of what it means to bring in light rail. But let's not just look at where we put things, but let's look at the impact on businesses, small businesses, as we think about where to put them. Let's look at the impact on education. Let's look at the impact on family well-being so that we don't just avoid the bad things, but we promote the good things. And so health impact assessments, looking at the impact of the kind of decisions that we're making that impact the physical environment on health. Wonderful examples with how to move forward. And then there's the social environment. I've had the opportunity, and those of you who've heard me speak before have heard me talk about growing up in a segregated St. Louis, Missouri in the 1950s and the early 60s. Total segregation, so that the place that I lived, the places where I prayed and played and volunteered, went to school, they were all black. And while the forced segregation that was the force behind creating this community is something for which this nation shall always be ashamed that it is part of our history, had so many negative connotations. One of the positive things that came out of it was forcing integrated communities. I often tell people, even though I have lived many places, that the racially segregated community that I grew up in is the most integrated community that I have ever experienced because it was economically integrated. It was economically integrated. Everybody was there. And the power of that in terms of creating social cohesion, social networks, was just extraordinary. And that's important for health and well-being. And place has a lot to do with that. And while no one would suggest that we go back to segregation to force economic integration, if we know the power of it, we certainly can plan in ways that we promote an integration that crosses those economic lines. And we can think about how to be able to break down some of the barriers that are the negative of what we've done by having concentrated poverty. We concentrate poverty. There's so much crime in so many neighborhoods. Crime causes responsible parents to keep their children inside, which impacts health because children are not getting exercise. Crime causes older people in our community to isolate themselves behind bars and not to go out, which creates a problem for the elderly in health because they don't have the social connections that they need. Crime obviously impacts health directly as people suffer from injury and other things, but it also creates a psychological, a mental trauma that impacts the health of children and family members going forward. So as we think about bringing in community policing, doing things like Added Value does in Brooklyn, New York, is a farmer's market run by the young people, growing fresh fruits and vegetables, getting those fresh fruits and vegetables into the schools, into the places where the elderly live, creating social cohesion at the same time that we're bringing in awareness of fresh fruits and vegetables and really bringing fresh fruits and vegetables into schools. So thinking about social cohesion and how to be able to promote that's very important for health. And then there's the service environment, that we know that one of the things that's very important for health is access to health care. And so being able to have clinics and other health care facilities in communities, and if they're not in communities, making sure that you have transportation that can connect to them wherever they are, absolutely important. But also being able to take advantage of the concentration of poverty and not just wring our hands about it and lament that it exists, but to do our programming and service provision in a way that really takes advantage of the fact that almost everybody in the neighborhood is eligible for everything. And so why are we doing it in a disjointed way, right? And no one has taken advantage of that more than Jeff Canada and his colleagues at the Harlem Children's Zone. What they have done is they have said, we live in an area in which all the children are poor. All of the children are receiving free and reduced lunch. Many of them are getting various forms of social services. They all are eligible for a Head Start. Why don't we identify many blocks, they now have gotten up to 97, and make a promise that every child in this zone is going to be able to reach his or her full potential. We have schools in the community. Let's make sure that those are good schools. And that if we can't improve the schools, let's make sure that we are being the advocates for our children in those schools, our children. And they've already started a charter school, too. But the thing that many people don't know about the Harlem Children's Zone is the overwhelming majority, at the level of 70%, of the children in the zone do not go to the Promise Academy. It's not like those amazing results that they're getting. Over 700 children in college now, and those kids didn't even experience the Promise Academy. They're making a difference for all of the children. So being able to think about not just providing services piecemeal, but to weave those services together into an elegant program of support that provides everything that's needed. That's what we really need to do to make sure that the services are there and that we're creating a service environment that makes a difference. The good news is, not only are these things aspirations, but right here in Cleveland, you've got a Promise neighborhood, that we have Promise neighborhoods blossoming all over the country. Because when then Senator Obama said, if I get elected president, I'm going to do 20 Promise neighborhoods inspired by the Harlem Children's Zone, Jeff Canada, who's on the board of PolicyLink, turned to me and said, well, we don't know if he's going to get elected, but we certainly don't want to end up in a situation in which he gets elected and we don't have a plan for what a Promise neighborhood would look like. So just based on faith, PolicyLink and the Harlem Children's Zone started planning the Promise neighborhoods. And based on faith, before the Promise Neighborhoods program was announced, we had a big meeting in New York, and over 1,000 people came, bringing teams of their superintendent, their community organization, their community foundations, came to find out how could they do it. And when the program was finally announced, they had hundreds and hundreds of applications, many of which were terrific. And the money has been in the budget. We had 21 planning grants the first time. Now we have 5 implementation grants, another 15 planning. But beyond that, we run at PolicyLink, the Promise Neighborhoods Institute at PolicyLink, where we're supporting the movement of those groups all across the nation that with money or not, designation or not, they are committed to building a Promise neighborhood and making sure that it's focused on results, that it's utilizing data, that it's identifying best practices, that it's working in partnership with community. So the good news is we're building the programs and they're getting picked up in federal policy, Promise neighborhoods. Choice, another program in the current administration that actually understands the power of place, and that it doesn't make sense to keep putting housing for poor people in communities that are not communities of opportunity. How to connect low-income housing with opportunity, educational opportunity, transportation opportunity, health opportunity, job opportunity. We have the Sustainable Communities Initiative that actually says that we need to think regionally. Cities do not operate alone. They operate in regions. Regions cannot thrive without strong cities, and cities are now part of regions, and it's regions that compete in the global economy. Not cities, not nations. It's regions that compete in the global economy. How do we make them equitable and integrated and able to tap all of their resources? We have programs like Strong Cities, Strong Communities that actually coming out of agencies working together in the Domestic Policy Council in the White House saying, you know, there's something wrong with programs that identify a problem based on places like Cleveland and Detroit and St. Louis and Oakland, and then we put out a competition, and the cities that compete successfully are none of those. They said there's something wrong there. And so they decided to develop a program called Strong Cities, Strong Communities, in which they place officials from the federal government in cities, in City Hall, to be able to help those places that need to compete to be able to compete and to build the capacity. So these things are happening, and they're happening all around. I will tell you that we're at a moment in time in which the agenda that you care about has become the nation's agenda. And we hit this moment with all the knowledge we need to be able to lead and go forward. And we understand that as we're putting forward our strategies, we cannot forget that place is so important. It can be a negative and take people down, or it can be a positive and lift people up. As we lift people up, we know that health is important. We know that economic engagement is important. We know that democratic participation is important. And that starts in the neighborhood. It starts in the places where people live. Place matters. Thank you very much.
Today, at the City Club, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring Angela Glover Blackwell, founder and CEO of PolicyLink. We will return to our speaker in a minute for the traditional City Club questions. Please formulate your questions for our speaker now, and remember that questions should be brief and to the point. We remind you that members and guests alike are welcome to attend the City Club forums, and we hope everyone listening will join the City Club. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3, WCLV, and WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partners are WVIZ, PBS Idea Stream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. This year, 2012, the City Club of Cleveland turns 100 years old. There are several programs scheduled, including the second in an encore speakers series, April 18th, with John Dean, the former White House counsel to President Richard Nixon. For more information on this and other programs, visit the 100th Anniversary tab on our website. We would like to welcome today at our table hosted by Case Western Reserve, Cleveland Progress Incorporated, the Raymond John Ween Foundation, St. Luke's Foundation, the Cuyahoga County Place Matters Team, Sisters of Charity Foundation, and the Swetland Center for Environmental Health. Thank you all for your support. Today's program is sponsored by the St. Luke's Foundation. Joining us today at the head table is Denise San Antonio Zeman. Denise, will you please stand and be recognized? We are also pleased to welcome students who are here as part of the City Club student program. Participation of these students is made possible by a generous grant from the Cleveland Clinic. With us today are students from Euclid High School. Will the students please stand and be recognized? Now we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today is City Club Program Director Carrie Miller and 100th Anniversary Assistant Director Betsy Wallace.
Good evening, ma'am. How you doing? In the area of public policy, what is the greatest need of on the state level in regards to legislators? What some of the ideas what should they address as far as closing the gap between poverty and education?
Well, education really is the issue. That we don't achieve equity without a huge improvement in the educational opportunities and outcomes for all children. And so when I say we're not a poor nation and we need to stop acting like one of the areas in which I really direct that statement is funding for education. And so I would hope that all people working at the state level would be asking what they can do to make sure that every jurisdiction throughout the state has the resources that they need for education. And we have a growing problem in the nation. I can't speak about Ohio, but I would be surprised if this were not true here. That when I talked about the changing demographics and 46.5% of children being children of color, we are still a nation in which the overwhelming majority of people over 65 are white, 80%. And in some states, that gulf is even more. Because as a nation, and I say this reluctantly, because I don't want people to feel uncomfortable, and I know it is uncomfortable to bring race into the conversation, but I say it because I think that we have to think about it and come to grips with it. Because we have failed to deal with our racial divide in this nation, which is not to say that we haven't done anything about it, but we haven't resolved it. We haven't resolved it in terms of not living together, not fully understanding each other. We haven't resolved it in terms of being able to embrace all children as our children. We still walk around, too many of us, with the sense of, these are my children, those are not. That notion, that racial divide, is becoming a generational divide in this country. Because this idea of those children and not investing in their education means that all children suffer. So if you're a white family and you move into an urban area and you hope that you'll be able to utilize the public education system, you will be disappointed because our racial divide has become a generational divide. That if you're a young white worker, you've recently graduated from college, you've gotten a job in the city, you're not making much money, you want to use public transportation, you are likely to be disappointed because we're not investing in public transit. 60% of public transit workers are people of color. People are feeling that it's for someone else. Our racial divide is becoming a generational divide. And so I know this is an uncomfortable conversation, but it's the conversation we have to have because we can't get our state legislators to step up and to make the investment that we need to make unless people realize three things really. One, the future of the country depends on what we do for the next generations. Two, all the children are our children. And three, education is the most important thing we can possibly invest in. Thank you.
Thank you for being here and for such an inspiring talk.
Thank you.
We are here with a $1 billion biomedical infrastructure, but a population whose health approximately rivals Yemen. The approach of the Jeffrey Canada approach that can make such a big difference in small areas, how do you see that as being scalable and sustainable versus sort of system changes that can affect everyone?
Excellent question, because the systems that we want to change need information. They need information. We have to understand that we're not in these projects, that sometimes we think of them as boutique projects, sometimes we think of them as huge prizes for communities that are lucky enough to get them, sometimes we think of them as anomalies, like there'll never be another Jeff Canada, there'll never be another Harlem Children's Zone. Some people actually think that. That's the wrong way to think about it. First, every community has leaders that have the potential to do what Jeff Canada has done. Jeff Canada did not come here fully born as Jeff Canada. Jeff Canada became the Jeff Canada that you know and love by running programs, by learning, by having mentors, by being supported by foundations and corporations. And so we all have the capacity to build that kind of leadership. We need to support leaders like that to be able to unleash their creativity, their charisma, to be able to bring in collaborating partners and persuade people to do things differently so we can have models of what works. But then we have to use those models to make systemic change. That's why PolicyLink is PolicyLink. Policy isn't, we don't do policy just because we love policy. We do policy because we love people. And because we have to learn from what works and then be a transmitter of that into policy language and legislation and initiatives so that we can change. And so never forget that the reason for doing things that are models, that are examples, that are experiments, is to be able to learn what works and then to use that to change systems, to change policy, and get to the scale we all need. What we have learned from the Harlem Children's Zone is that even a wonderful school is not enough. And the reason that that is so important to learn is because as we got into the educational reform work, we got so focused on the schoolhouse and the classroom that we forgot the results of the natural experiment that has been going on in this country for decades. And that's been an experiment by middle-class families with resources to say, we're not going to leave it just to the schools. And they never have. They know that summer enrichment programs are very good because things can get lost in the summer. They know that not every child finds his identity in the academic work. For some it's theater, for some it's music, for some it's sports. So that having all of those things available either in the school or in the community is important for education. They know that something can happen in a house where there's no place to study, where there's no one to encourage you to do homework, so that mentoring is important. And they also know that every child needs to have an advocate. That's what middle-class families have been doing. They've been engaged in that experiment. It worked. And the Harlem Children's Zone has shown that it works for poor children, too. And so now we need to make sure that our educational system incorporates it. So always we're looking for systems change. Thank you for that question.
Hi, I'm Lynn Singer from the Swetland Center for Environmental Health at Case Western Reserve University. Recently, the New York Times reported on corporate initiatives for online home-based education that's being marketed to urban school districts. And I wondered if your group has heard of this and has any policy recommendations related to it.
I haven't heard of it. I saw the article, but I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you if you could tell me just a little bit more about it.
Well, I only know from the article.
From the article.
Apparently, they're marketing it, and it seems to be quite successful in some urban school districts, to the school district as a whole package, as the schools are unsafe, and that this is a better alternative. And
I'm not going to have an opinion about it, but I'm just going to pick up on some of the implications of what you said. One is that we need to fix our schools. We need to make the environment safe, and we need to do whatever we can to make sure that all children can learn in healthy, supportive environments. And we need to make sure that we are providing parents and families with multiple choices in terms of what they can do now while we're working on that. I have always sort of taken that position, gotten in many debates about charter schools and all of that. And I have a personal opinion that anything that undermines public education is not good for the nation. Because the thing that has made the nation strong has been a strong system of public education. It was one of the things... It was one of the things that was so important during Reconstruction, to be able to look at things like public education and get those in place. And we know that places that have good public education systems really are preparing the nation and the children for the future. And so we need to be suspicious of anything that systematically undermines public education. That's my personal view. And I try not to be too definite about what parents ought to do for their children who are now in schools that are failing them. I trust parents. I trust parents. I think that parents make good decisions, but we have to make sure that parents have the information that they need in order to make good decisions. I'm going to talk about charters for just a moment. I know nothing about your situation and your charters. What I do know is that the reason to do a charter school is for systemic change. The reason to do a charter school is to be able to get away from the rules and regulations and to figure out what works, and then to be able to use that knowledge about what works to change the system. If we have a system of charter schools where the charter schools are not part of a feedback loop, we are not utilizing our resources very effectively. And parents need to understand whether or not those schools are working. They need to have data. They need to be able to compare it. And the same is true for what you suggested. So my answer is that I believe in public education, don't like to see it undermined, want to see parents respected and able to make their own decisions, but they're not respected if they're making decisions without information. Thank you.
Thank you for being in Cleveland one more time. I really appreciate it. We have been very fortunate here to receive a HUD Sustainable Communities grant of some size, and some of the people in this room are working on it. Do you have any suggestions or advice from other communities on how to make it truly transformative?
I certainly do. And one thing I hope is that you are in touch with PolicyLink and with Kalima Rose at PolicyLink, because Kalima Rose is leading the PolicyLink work with the Sustainable Communities initiatives across the country to help them put the equity agenda front and center. in doing that work, we had, as soon as the applications went out, a series of webinars for community-based organizations and equity advocates around the country to let them know that this opportunity was coming, and it was an equity opportunity. Because this is one of those things that the metropolitan planning organizations and the Chamber of Commerce and county and city governments were all very excited about, and we felt that if community-based organizations and equity advocates weren't in there making their voices heard, pushing the whole issue, that equity would be left off the table. Those webinars were very well attended. Since the grants have been going out, we have been systematically helping communities across the country understand how important community engagement is. That we can't really do equity work without being in partnership with the people whose lives we want to impact. And so the community engagement process is very important. And there are strategies for community engagement. There's capacity building for community engagement. And the capacity building is on both sides. Often when we say capacity building, we're thinking of low-income people of color who don't know how to participate. But really, low-income people of color often need less capacity building than some of the leadership that is not of color, that has a long history of going forward and doing things without listening and hearing the people whose voices are crucial. And there are strategies for learning to do that. Learning how to have meetings, how to facilitate them, where to do them, what kind of agenda to have, what kind of time frame for planning to put in place. Very often, by the time the community gets pulled in, the thing's got to be submitted tomorrow. And we just want to check that box, as opposed to understanding early on that you have to get people engaged early. You have to make sure they understand what's going on. You have to make sure that the final plans reflect them. Then, as we're going forward, all of the things that make for sustainable communities are the stuff of equity. That we have got to stop thinking that the only place we're working on equity is when we're doing services. When we're doing light rail, we're doing equity. We're either creating an economic opportunity or we're hurting one. Anything that has to be built is an equity opportunity. PolicyLink has the PolicyLink Center for Infrastructure Equity. And we had that before infrastructure became a household word. We had it back in 2007 because we understood that for too many people who are being left behind, they are being left behind because their places are not competitive. They don't have broadband. They don't have transit systems. They don't have clean and fresh water. They don't have an infrastructure to support engagement in the global economy. And so infrastructure, to be done right, you have to ask, what are the best projects for equity? You get more jobs from repairing roads and bridges than building new ones. And you get more jobs doing public transit than repairing roads and bridges. And so asking what projects produce equity, asking how we get those jobs to people. We're very excited about the work that they're doing in Missouri, where they're taking their transit money and they're making sure that they're training a pipeline to be able to get those jobs. So thinking about the jobs. When you think about how to you talk about health being a major employer here, how do we make sure that we're thinking about the health industry in the regional context and making sure that our community colleges, our academies and the high schools, the kinds of exposure that we're providing for people who need jobs, that we're driving people into those health jobs. So the Sustainable Communities Initiative is really an equity initiative. And we can make it an equity initiative by studying every turn how to bring a lens that says, how do we create greater opportunity for those who are left behind with every decision that we make? Thanks for that question.
Hi, Ms. Blackwell. How are you?
Hi, fine. Thank you.
Thank you for coming here. I actually, you just really kind of answered my question. I live in a community in the central neighborhood, which is has high poverty, has the largest concentration of public housing, surrounded by billion-dollar development. And so I just wanted you to continue to speak on outreach and how important it is for institutions and organizations to get on the ground, to come into the community and talk to people. To get on the ground, to walk through the community, to knock on doors.
Absolutely. And I want you to know that every place I go, I talk about the Evergreen Cooperative. It is one of the things that we lift up because it's an example of taking anchor institutions and getting them to think about what they're spending, what they're doing, and how to connect that to an equity agenda. So we need to have more examples like that around the country. I also think that it's been very useful to see things like Market Creek Plaza. I don't know how many of you know about it in San Diego. Market Creek Plaza is a wonderful example of taking a low-income community and a foundation, the Jacobs Family Foundation, working with the residents, has been able to transform that community and make it a place where the people who lived there before can enjoy the benefits. What happened was this. Joe Jacobs, who ran the Jacobs Family Foundation and was doing international philanthropy, mostly focused on microcredit, decided as he got older that he actually wanted to come back home and do something for the place where he had been able to be so helped. And so he decided to focus on the poorest neighborhoods in San Diego, and they identified that as the diamond neighborhoods. But what they did before they did anything was they hired residents to go out and talk to their neighbors and ask, if you were going to see an effort to try to transform this community, what would you want? Before they did anything. And they paid people to do it because that is work. That is work. And so they paid it, they recognized it as work, and then they came back and listened to what was gathered. And what was gathered was quite extensive, but I want to talk about one thing. In the middle of the diamond neighborhoods was an abandoned factory, 20 acres, chain link fence all around it. An eyesore, separated community, and kept the community from being a destination. People didn't like the factory before it closed because in the morning, cars would stream in from people knew not where, and at night they would stream out. Same way. Nobody in the neighborhood ever worked there. One day they woke up and there was just a lock on it and it was done. People said, we want this opened up. We want to be able to use this space, and we need a grocery store. And when that grocery store comes, we'd like for it to be part of an economic engine in this community where we can have our own entrepreneurial things benefiting from the fact that foot traffic will be coming into our community. And we would like for it to also be a place where we can come together and get to know each other. And we want the jobs there. Listening to the community and creating a resident-led committee for every one of the things that I just mentioned. Finding the grocery store, getting the jobs, helping the entrepreneurs, and finally they said, when it's successful, we'd like to be able to reap some wealth from it. And they had a committee for that too. The story is that when the store opened, 91% of the people who worked there lived in the community. 91%. And they've been able to do that because when they first told the store owners that we want to work there, they said, well, that's going to be tough because we're a union shop. You have to have this job before you have that one. They problem solved, and they said, well, before you break ground, why don't you hire us in where we can enter and place us in stores all over the region? And that's what they did. So by the time the store was built and opened, there were people, and they came and they occupied it. They said, we don't just want to see someone else come into the community and build it. We have women and minority entrepreneurs. We want them to build it. And so they said, well, but it's going to be a problem because you're not competitive in the bidding. You haven't done anything this big. You don't really know how to do it. They said, well, we could learn. And so the foundation gave money to an intermediary that helped those women and minority contractors be competitive. 69% of the contractors on the job were women and minority businesses. They said, we want to have our own businesses. But your businesses haven't been successful. You don't know how to run a business. You don't have a track record. And so rather than just leave it at that, they brought in other people who had business expertise to help the entrepreneurs. And I love it when I go there. I always end up spending some money at where the world stops, where all of the cultures have a shop where they sell things. And it's just lovely. And then as the thing began to be successful, people said, well, all this money shouldn't be leaving our community. We want to be owners. Well, you can't do that. Can't sell shares to people who are poor. We have laws against that in the state of California. And so they put together a committee. For 4.5 years, they worked with the California Department of Corporations to be able to craft a way to protect low-income people, but also to sell shares. And they sold $500,000 worth of shares to the community, and the average owner was a black woman with 2 children making less than $30,000 a year. When you work with residents, their wisdom, their tenacity, their determination can do anything. And we have models of how to be able to accomplish that.
Hi, I'm so glad that I was able to meet you, to hear you today. I live in East Cleveland, and also I'm a community researcher with Case Western Reserve's Social Justice Institute, which was founded by Dr. Rhonda Williams right here. And I also write for the Neighborhood Voice newspaper, which was originally founded by the organization you talked about, which is the Evergreen Cooperatives.
The Evergreen Cooperative.
Right. Mm-hmm. But my question really is more of a past question. I grew up in the 60s and 70s in a Cleveland predominantly black neighborhood, working class neighborhood, middle class. What do you think happened? Because I saw it happen after like 1980, and it never has just continued on a downward spiral since then. So what do you think actually went on?
Yes, there have been books written about it, and so the wisdom that I'm going to cite is not my own, though I experienced it too, so I can actually vouch for the story being true. But there have been several good books written about what happened. We started off, because of segregation, having these economically integrated black communities. And many of these communities had been white communities before. When my family moved into our house, I talk about growing up in the black community, but I will tell you, the day that we moved in, we were just the second black family to move into that neighborhood, the first having moved in the day before. And I often, and I often say, I know that we were a powerful family because we caused all the white people to move off the block within a very, very, very short period of time. But left behind was quite a wonderful infrastructure. Grocery stores, drug stores, parks, beautiful streets that were tree-lined with nice sidewalks that were well-maintained. And all of that remained ours for a number of years until, as you say, something started to happen. Part of what happened was the black middle class had increasing opportunities to move to other neighborhoods. And people took them, and you can't blame people for taking them. I mean, people had been told you can only live in this part of the city, and that's the only place where people had been able to put down roots. And when new opportunities opened up, people took them. But as they took them, the buffer disappeared. My father was the head of the block association on the 4900 block of Terry for all my growing up and well into my adult years. I mean, he was 80 years old, and I was long gone when they decided they were going to put a Domino's pizza on the corner. If you remember, Domino's used to promise to deliver in 30 minutes. And my father, Mr. Glover, and his partner, Mr. Cook, decided we're not going to have cars going down the street trying to get someplace in 30 minutes. And because they knew the aldermen, they knew how to interact with City Hall, they were able to go and stop it. Well, when my dad moved to Oakland and when Mr. Cook died, that was pretty much the end of it. And so we lost the buffer. The other thing that happens is that school integration really did cause a lot of people who were white to be able to flee cities, and taking with them the tax base and the political clout to keep the schools good. And once the schools went down, responsible parents who could get away got away. And so you saw so much then happen in terms of moving out. And then we failed to value the people who lived there. We didn't invest, and we've ended up where we've ended up. And we can move out of this, and we can do something very good. Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a Friday Forum featuring Angela Glover Blackwell, founder and CEO of PolicyLink. Thank you very much, Ms. Blackwell. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.